My name is Mark, and my wife Sarah and I recently moved into what seemed like the perfect suburban neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-manicured lawns, and neighbors who greeted us with warm smiles and freshly baked cookies. It was everything we had hoped for, a fresh start away from the bustling city. Our first night in the new house was uneventful, and we fell asleep to the comforting sounds of crickets chirping and the distant hum of sprinklers. But it didn't take long for things to start feeling off. The neighbors were almost too friendly, if that makes any sense. Every morning, someone would stop by to say hello, offering more baked goods or inviting us to community events. It felt like they were always watching, always waiting for the perfect moment to engage us in conversation. One evening, Sarah and I were unpacking boxes in the living room when we heard a knock on the door. It was our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, a sweet elderly woman who had been particularly insistent on us joining her for tea. "Good evening, dears," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "I just wanted to drop off some homemade jam and see how you're settling in." "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," I replied, accepting the jar. "We're doing great, just trying to get everything organized." She lingered at the doorway, her eyes darting around our house as if searching for something. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We're a close-knit community here, and we look out for each other." As soon as she left, Sarah turned to me with a puzzled expression. "Did you notice how she kept looking around? It was like she was trying to find something." I shrugged it off, chalking it up to nosy neighbors. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The following day, we decided to explore the neighborhood. It was a Saturday, and the streets were bustling with activity. Children played in the yards, and groups of neighbors gathered in driveways, chatting and laughing. We were about to head back home when we noticed a flyer on a nearby lamppost. It was a missing person notice for a woman named Emily Carter. The date on the flyer was from 2 weeks ago, and it struck me as odd that we hadn't heard anything about it from our overly communicative neighbors. "Do you think she's still missing?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with concern. "I don't know," I replied, feeling a knot of unease forming in my stomach. "Let's ask around and see if anyone knows anything." When we returned home, we went next door to Mrs. Thompson's house. She answered the door almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for us. "Hello again, dears. What can I do for you?" she asked, her smile unwavering. "We saw a flyer about a missing woman named Emily Carter," Sarah said. "Do you know anything about her?" Mrs. Thompson's smile faltered for a split second, so brief that I almost missed it. "Oh, Emily. Such a shame. She moved away suddenly. I believe she found a job in another state. Didn't get a chance to say goodbye." Her explanation felt rehearsed, and the unease in my stomach grew. As we walked back to our house, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and saw several neighbors standing in their yards, their eyes following us with unsettling intensity. "Mark, this place is starting to creep me out," Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. "Something's not right here." I nodded in agreement. "We need to be careful. Let's keep our eyes and ears open and see if we can figure out what's really going on." As night fell, the sense of dread only intensified. We double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows before heading to bed. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood, every creak and rustle magnified in the silence. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible tapping at our bedroom window. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I glanced over at Sarah, who was still sound asleep, and decided to investigate. I crept to the window and slowly pulled back the curtain, my breath catching in my throat as I peered outside. There, standing in the shadows of our backyard, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its gaze locked onto me. A chill ran down my spine as the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at me. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the night. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. I knew without a doubt that something sinister was lurking in our seemingly perfect neighborhood, and I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Sleep didn't come easily after the encounter with the figure in the backyard. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I had seen. By morning, I was exhausted, but the urgency to uncover the truth about our new neighborhood overpowered my fatigue. Over breakfast, I told Sarah about the figure at the window. Her face paled, and she clutched her coffee mug tightly. "Mark, what if Emily didn't just move away? What if something happened to her? I think you're right, I said, lowering my voice. We need to find out more about her and see if there have been other disappearances. We decided to start by visiting the local library to look through old newspapers and public records. The librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Green, was more than happy to help us. She showed us to the archives room and left us to our research. Hours passed as we pored over newspaper clippings and missing person reports. To our horror, we discovered that Emily Carter wasn't the only person who had vanished. Over the past 5 years, there had been a pattern of disappearances, all within our neighborhood. Each case had been quietly swept under the rug, with vague explanations about people moving away or starting new lives elsewhere. "This can't be a coincidence," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Something is happening here, and it's being covered up." As we were about to leave, Mrs. Green approached us, her expression serious. I couldn't help but overhear. "Be careful who you talk to about this. There are those in this town who don't take kindly to prying eyes." Her warning sent a shiver down my spine, but it only strengthened our resolve. We thanked her and headed home, more determined than ever to uncover the truth. That evening, we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to pick up on any clues or suspicious behavior. As we strolled down the streets, we noticed something strange. Almost every house had security cameras, all pointed outward. It was as if the residents were more concerned about what was outside than what was inside. When we passed by the park, we saw a group of neighbors gathered around a picnic table, their voices hushed. They stopped talking as we approached, their eyes following us with unnerving intensity. One of them, a man named Mr. Harris, forced a smile and waved us over. "Evening, Mark, Sarah. Care to join us?" he asked, his tone overly friendly. "Thanks, but we're just taking a walk," I replied, trying to sound casual. Mr. Harris's smile faded, replaced by a look of mild irritation. "Suit yourselves. Just remember, we're all one big family here. We look out for each other." His words felt more like a threat than a reassurance. We quickly excused ourselves and continued our walk, our sense of unease growing with every step. As we neared our house, we noticed something that made our blood run cold. A shadowy figure stood in the driveway, motionless. It was the same figure I had seen the night before. This time it was closer, its features still obscured by the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly backed away, disappearing into the shadows once again. We hurried inside, locking the door behind us. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. I reported the sightings, hoping they would take us seriously. The officer who arrived was polite but dismissive. "Probably just a neighborhood kid playing a prank," he said, glancing around our yard. "But we'll keep an eye out." His lack of concern did little to ease our fears. That night, as we lay in bed, we heard the tapping again. This time it was coming from the front door. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, Sarah close behind me. I shone the light through the peephole, but there was no one there. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Summoning all my courage, I unlocked the door and yanked it open. To my shock, there was no one there. But something caught my eye. A small, folded piece of paper taped to the door. I grabbed it and quickly shut the door behind me. "What does it say?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. I unfolded the paper, my hands trembling. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "Stop digging or you'll be next." Our blood ran cold. It was clear that someone didn't want us to uncover the truth about the disappearances. But we had come too far to turn back now. We were determined to find out what was happening in our seemingly perfect neighborhood, no matter the cost. The threat left on our door was a stark warning, but it only fueled our determination to uncover the truth. Sarah and I spent the next few days on high alert, watching for any signs of danger and trying to gather more information discreetly. Our first breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a man named David who lived a few streets over. He approached us while we were walking to the grocery store, his eyes darting around nervously. "I heard you've been asking about the disappearances," he said in a low voice. "Meet me tonight at the park. I have something you need to see." That evening, under the cover of darkness, we made our way to the park. David was waiting for us near the playground, a large envelope clutched in his hands. He glanced around before speaking. "I've lived here my whole life," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I've seen things that would make your skin crawl. This neighborhood, it's not what it seems." He handed us the envelope. Inside were photographs and documents detailing the disappearances. There were pictures of Emily Carter, along with several others who had vanished over the years. But what caught our attention were the notes scribbled in the margins of the documents. "They didn't move away," David continued. "They were taken." "Taken by who?" I asked, my heart pounding. David hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "There's a group here, a kind of cult. They believe in some ancient ritual, a way to gain power and immortality. They take people, sacrifice them." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's insane. How do you know this?" "My brother was one of them," David replied, his voice shaking. "He tried to leave to expose them, but they got to him first. He disappeared just like the others." Before we could ask more questions, David froze, his eyes wide with fear. "We're being watched. We need to leave. Now." We quickly made our way back to our house, our minds reeling from the information. The idea of a cult operating in our quiet neighborhood seemed unbelievable, but the evidence was there, right in front of us. That night, we pored over the documents, trying to piece together the puzzle. The cult seemed to have roots in ancient rituals, with symbols and phrases that we couldn't decipher. But one thing was clear. They were dangerous, and they wouldn't stop until they silenced anyone who got too close to the truth. As we were going through the last of the documents, we heard a noise outside. It was a low, rumbling sound, like heavy machinery. We rushed to the window and saw several trucks parked in front of a house down the street. Men in dark clothing were unloading large crates and carrying them inside. "What are they doing?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my heart racing. "But we need to find out." We waited until the men had left before sneaking out of the house. We approached the house cautiously, staying in the shadows. The front door was slightly ajar, and we slipped inside, our nerves on edge. The interior of the house was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging in the hallway. We crept through the rooms, our footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. In the basement, we found what we were looking for: a makeshift altar, surrounded by candles and strange symbols drawn on the walls. On the altar were photographs of the missing people, along with personal items that had belonged to them. There were also books, ancient texts filled with disturbing illustrations and descriptions of rituals. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "This is what they're doing." We took as many photographs as we could, documenting everything. As we were about to leave, we heard footsteps above us. Someone was coming. We quickly hid behind a stack of crates, our hearts pounding. The footsteps grew louder, and a man appeared at the top of the stairs. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the room. After a few tense moments, he turned and left, locking the door behind him. We waited until we were sure he was gone before making our escape. We ran back to our house, our minds racing. We had the evidence we needed, but we knew we were in more danger than ever. That night, as we tried to sleep, we heard the tapping at the window again. This time it was accompanied by a low, menacing whisper. "Stop, or you'll be next." We knew we couldn't stop. We had to expose the cult and save whoever we could. But as the darkness closed in around us, we realized we were up against something far more sinister than we had ever imagined. The next morning, we woke up to find a new note slipped under our door. The message was clear: "Leave now, or face the consequences." The words were written in the same jagged handwriting as before, but this time there was an added sense of urgency. We knew we couldn't go to the police. They had already dismissed our concerns once. We decided our best chance was to find more information about the cult and expose them ourselves. The documents David had given us hinted at a deeper network, one that extended beyond our neighborhood. Sarah and I spent the day researching the symbols and phrases we had found in the basement. It was slow going, but we began to piece together a disturbing picture. The cult, known as the Hidden Ones, believed in an ancient deity that required human sacrifices to grant them power and longevity. The missing people were their offerings. We realized that the upcoming neighborhood festival, which everyone had been so insistent on us attending, was likely a cover for their next ritual. We had to find a way to stop it. That evening, we received a frantic call from David. "They know about you," he whispered urgently. "You need to leave now. They're planning something for tonight." Before we could respond, the line went dead. Our hearts pounded with fear and determination. We grabbed the documents, our phones, and a flashlight, then rushed to David's house, hoping to find him before it was too late. When we arrived, the house was eerily quiet. The front door was ajar, and we stepped inside cautiously. The living room was in disarray, as if there had been a struggle. We found David in the kitchen, slumped over the table, unconscious but still breathing. A quick search revealed a tranquilizer dart on the floor. "We need to get him out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. As we tried to lift David, we heard footsteps approaching the house. We barely had time to hide in a closet before the door creaked open and several men entered, speaking in low tones. "They can't have gone far," one of them said. "Search the area. They have to be found before the ritual." We held our breath, praying they wouldn't find us. After what felt like an eternity, the men left, but we knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. We had to act quickly. We managed to wake David and help him to his feet. He was groggy but coherent enough to understand the danger we were in. Together, we made our way to his car and drove to the outskirts of town, where we found a small motel to regroup. David explained that the Hidden Ones had been watching us closely since our arrival. They saw us as a threat to their secrecy and were determined to eliminate us. "We need to expose them," he said, his voice hoarse. "But we can't do it alone." We spent the night contacting local journalists, sending them the evidence we had gathered. Most were skeptical, but a few agreed to look into it. We knew it wasn't enough, but it was a start. As dawn approached, we realized we couldn't stay hidden forever. We had to confront the cult head-on, disrupt their ritual, and save any potential victims. We returned to the neighborhood, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a determination to end the Hidden Ones' reign of terror. The festival was already in full swing, with neighbors laughing and chatting as if nothing was amiss. But we knew better. We slipped away from the crowd and made our way to the house where we had found the altar. The door was locked this time, but David managed to pick the lock and we slipped inside. The basement was prepared for the ritual. Candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the center of the room was an unconscious woman, bound and gagged, her face pale with fear. "We have to hurry," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We freed the woman and began photographing everything, documenting the scene for the journalists. As we worked, we heard footsteps approaching. The cult members were coming. We hid in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. When the door opened and the cult leader entered, we jumped out, cameras flashing, blinding them with the bright lights. "You're exposed," I shouted, hoping to buy us some time. "The world will know what you've done." The leader sneered, his eyes cold and calculating. "You think this will stop us? You're fools. The Hidden Ones cannot be stopped." As the cult members lunged at us, we fought back, using whatever we could find to defend ourselves. The struggle was fierce, but we managed to overpower them, locking them in the basement before fleeing with the woman. We drove to the nearest police station, where we presented our evidence. This time they took us seriously. The photographs and documents were enough to launch an investigation, and soon the neighborhood was swarming with law enforcement. The Hidden Ones were arrested, their secret exposed to the world. The missing people were finally given justice, and the neighborhood began to heal. But even as we tried to move on, we couldn't shake the feeling that something darker still lingered. The Hidden Ones might have been stopped, but their sinister influence would haunt us forever. The neighborhood was in an uproar following the arrests. The Hidden Ones had been dismantled, but the chilling memories of their deeds lingered like a dark shadow over our lives. Sarah and I tried to return to a sense of normalcy, but the horrors we had uncovered were hard to forget. Despite the police presence, there was a pervasive sense of unease. People spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact as if fearing that acknowledging the truth would somehow bring it back. We were hailed as heroes by some, but others avoided us, blaming us for disturbing the peace of the community. One evening, as we were having dinner, there was a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Green, the librarian who had helped us with our research. She looked pale and anxious, clutching a worn book to her chest. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something you need to know." We invited her in, and she handed us the book. It was an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This belonged to the founder of the Hidden Ones," Mrs. Green explained. "I found it in the library archives. It details their origins and their true purpose. You need to read it." As we flipped through the journal, a sense of dread settled over us. The founder, a man named Jonathan Ashford, had written extensively about his beliefs and rituals. He spoke of an ancient entity that required not just sacrifices, but the souls of the willing. The Hidden Ones believed that by offering these souls, they could achieve immortality and immense power. But there was something more. A passage caught our eye, detailing a prophecy about the last ritual, which would take place during a lunar eclipse, set to occur in just a few days. The ritual would summon the entity into our world, granting the cult unimaginable power. "We have to stop this," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "But how?" I asked. "We don't even know if there are any cult members left." Mrs. Green sighed. "The police arrested many of them, but not all. There are still followers out there, and they will try to complete the ritual. We decided to take action. We couldn't rely on the police alone. They had already underestimated the cult once. We needed to find out where the remaining members were and prevent the ritual from happening." Over the next few days, we worked tirelessly, combing through the journal and cross-referencing it with the documents and photographs we had gathered. It led us to an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town, a place that had once been a meeting ground for the cult. The night of the lunar eclipse arrived. We made our way to the mansion, armed with cameras, flashlights, and a sense of impending doom. The air was thick with tension as we approached the decaying building, its windows dark and foreboding. Inside, the atmosphere was oppressive, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. We could hear faint chanting echoing through the halls, growing louder as we descended into the basement. There, we found a group of robed figures gathered around a crude altar. The leader, a man with piercing eyes and a cold smile, raised his hands chanting in a language we couldn't understand. "Stop!" I shouted, stepping forward. "This ends now." The leader turned, his eyes narrowing. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The entity will come and you will all suffer for your interference." As he spoke, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows closing in around us. The air crackled with energy, and a low, rumbling noise filled the space. Desperate, Sarah and I lunged at the leader, knocking him to the ground. The other cult members swarmed us, but we fought back, determined to stop the ritual. In the chaos, Mrs. Green managed to reach the altar, knocking over the candles and disrupting the ritual. The chanting ceased, and the oppressive energy began to dissipate. The cult members, realizing their plan had failed, fled into the night. We collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. The immediate threat had been averted, but we knew the fight wasn't over. The journal had hinted at other rituals, other ways the cult could try to summon the entity. As we left the mansion, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, we vowed to continue our fight against the Hidden Ones. We couldn't let their dark legacy continue, not after everything we had seen and endured. But deep down, we knew the shadows of the past would always linger, a constant reminder of the evil that had once thrived in our seemingly perfect neighborhood. The days following the failed ritual were a blur of restless nights and constant vigilance. The authorities had intensified their efforts to root out the remaining members of the Hidden Ones, but the cult's pervasive influence was difficult to eradicate. Sarah and I were haunted by the knowledge that their dark plans might still be in motion. Despite our exhaustion, we continued to dig deeper into the history of the Hidden Ones. We spent hours in the library, searching for any clues that might help us anticipate their next move. Mrs. Green, ever supportive, provided us with more archival materials and kept an eye out for any unusual activity. One afternoon, while going through old newspapers, we stumbled upon a series of articles about a string of mysterious deaths that had occurred in the late 1800s. The victims had all been prominent members of the community, and their deaths had been attributed to accidents or natural causes. However, the articles hinted at something more sinister, a pattern of deaths that coincided with lunar eclipses. "This can't be a coincidence," Sarah muttered, her finger tracing the dates. "The Hidden Ones have been active for far longer than we thought." Our research led us to the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, where many of the victims had been buried. We decided to visit the cemetery, hoping to find more clues. The cemetery was a bleak and desolate place, overgrown with weeds and shaded by gnarled trees. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. As we wandered among the gravestones, we noticed a mausoleum that stood apart from the rest. Its stone facade was weathered and covered in strange symbols that matched those we had seen in the journal. The door was slightly ajar, and a chill ran down my spine as we approached. Inside the mausoleum, we found a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with more symbols, and in the center of the room was an ornate stone sarcophagus. As we examined it, we discovered a hidden compartment containing a set of old yellowed scrolls. "These must be important," Sarah whispered, carefully unrolling one of the scrolls. "Look at this. It's a detailed description of their rituals and prophecies." We took photographs of the scrolls and carefully rewrapped them, intending to study them further back at home. As we were leaving the mausoleum, we heard a noise behind us. We turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, cloaked in shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the confined space. The figure stepped forward, revealing an elderly man with piercing blue eyes. His expression was one of both sadness and determination. "My name is Samuel Ashford," he said, his voice trembling. "I am the last surviving descendant of Jonathan Ashford, the founder of the Hidden Ones." We stared at him in shock, unsure whether to trust him. Sensing our hesitation, Samuel raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I know what my ancestors did was wrong," he continued. "I've spent my entire life trying to undo their evil. Please, let me help you." Reluctantly, we agreed to hear him out. Samuel led us to his modest home, where he showed us a collection of artifacts and documents he had gathered over the years. He explained that he had been monitoring the cult's activities and had tried to thwart them whenever possible. "The prophecy you discovered is real," Samuel said gravely, "but there is a way to stop it for good. The entity they seek to summon is bound by certain rules. If we can disrupt the ritual in a specific way, we can banish it forever." He showed us a diagram of the ritual site, detailing the positions of the cult members and the necessary steps to complete the banishment. It was a daunting task, but we knew it was our only chance to end the cult's reign of terror. That night, we prepared for the final confrontation. We gathered our supplies and made our way to the mansion where the cult had planned their next ritual. The lunar eclipse was fast approaching, and the air was thick with anticipation. As we approached the mansion, we saw the cult members gathered in the clearing, their chanting growing louder as the moon began to darken. We took our positions, following Samuel's instructions to the letter. The ritual began, and the air crackled with energy. The cult leader raised his hands, calling upon the entity to appear. Just as the portal began to open, we sprang into action, disrupting the ritual and scattering the cult members. Samuel chanted the banishment spell, his voice rising above the chaos. The portal wavered and a deafening roar filled the air. The entity, a shadowy, malevolent presence, struggled to break through, but Samuel's spell held it at bay. With one final thunderous clap, the portal collapsed, and the entity was banished. The cult members, realizing their plans had been thwarted, fled into the night, leaving us alone in the clearing. We stood there, breathless and exhausted, as the first light of dawn began to break. Samuel approached us, a weary smile on his face. "It's over," he said softly. "The Hidden Ones will never threaten anyone again." As we made our way back to the neighborhood, a sense of peace settled over us. The shadows of the past had been banished, and the community could finally begin to heal. But even as we celebrated our victory, we knew the echoes of darkness would linger, a reminder of the evil that had once thrived in our seemingly perfect neighborhood. The dawn after our victory felt different, lighter, freer. The oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the neighborhood seemed to have lifted, and for the first time in months, we felt a glimmer of hope. The news of our confrontation with the Hidden Ones and the banishment of the entity spread quickly. The media picked up the story, and the once skeptical journalists now praised our courage and determination. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The police, bolstered by the evidence we had gathered, conducted thorough investigations, ensuring that any remaining cult members were brought to justice. The community began to heal, united by the shared trauma and the collective relief of knowing the threat was gone. Sarah and I were invited to speak at a town hall meeting, where we shared our story and thanked the residents for their support. As we stood on the stage looking out at the familiar faces, we felt a deep sense of gratitude and belonging. "We couldn't have done this without each and every one of you," I said, my voice steady. "Your strength and resilience gave us the courage to fight back. Together, we've overcome something truly terrifying." The crowd erupted in applause, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time, it felt like we were truly part of the community. As the weeks passed, we continued to work with Samuel Ashford, documenting the history of the hidden ones and ensuring that their dark legacy would be remembered as a cautionary tale. We also kept in touch with the journalists who had helped us, providing them with updates and further evidence of the cult's activities. One afternoon, as we were organizing the documents in our living room, there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Green, holding a small wrapped package. "I found this in the library archives," she said, handing it to us. "I think it belongs to you." We unwrapped the package to find an old photograph of the neighborhood taken over a century ago. In the background, we could see the mansion where the final ritual had taken place, standing proud and foreboding even then. Attached to the photograph was a note. "To those who seek the truth, may you always find the light in the darkness." Tears welled up in our eyes as we looked at the photograph, realizing the enormity of what we had accomplished. We had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged victorious, not just for ourselves, but for the entire community. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The scars of the past remained, but they were healing, slowly but surely. The neighborhood thrived, its residents closer than ever, bound by the shared experience of overcoming evil. One evening, as Sarah and I sat on our porch watching the sunset, we reflected on everything that had happened. "Do you think it's really over?" Sarah asked, her voice soft. I took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I think so. We've done everything we can to ensure that the hidden ones can't come back. And if they ever do, we'll be ready." She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. "We've been through so much, I'm just glad we have each other." We sat in comfortable silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded, giving way to the soft glow of twilight. The neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, a stark contrast to the terror we had faced not so long ago. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, I felt a sense of closure. We had faced the darkness and found the light, and though the shadows of the past might linger, they no longer held power over us. Our story had come to an end, but our lives were just beginning. Together we would face whatever challenges came our way, knowing that we had the strength and resilience to overcome anything. The light of dawn had brought with it a new beginning, and we were ready to embrace it one day at a time.